Elias had been born on a quiet, backwater planet far from the central hubs of civilization. His world wasn't one of grand cities or powerful armies. It was a place where life was simple, and people lived off the land, far from the chaos of the universe. His family had been poor, like most others in the village, but they were happy. They worked the fields, grew their food, and shared stories by the fire at night. That all changed when the Zelter came. The Zelter were ruthless invaders from a distant galaxy. Their empire had already conquered countless worlds, and now they had their sights set on Elia's home. They came without warning, descending from the sky in massive warships, their dark, metallic hulls blocking out the sun. The people of the village didn't even have time to flee before the invaders landed. The Zelter soldiers, towering and fearsome, stormed the village, destroying everything in their path. They didn't care for mercy or compassion. Their only goal was control. Elia's family was among the first to be captured. He had watched helplessly as his father was dragged away, shouting at him to run, to escape. But Elias couldn't leave them. He was just a child, not yet old enough to understand the full weight of what was happening. His mother was taken as well, and he saw the fear in her eyes as she was pulled away, never to return. For days, Elias wandered the ruins of his village, now a ghost town, searching for any sign of life. His heart ached with every step. The people he loved, the place he had called home, were gone. His world had been ripped apart by a force greater than him, and he was left with nothing but the bitter taste of loss. Eventually, the Zelter soldiers found him. He had been hiding in the woods, hoping to escape the horrors that had befallen his people. But they weren't interested in letting him go. They took him, shackled him, and brought him before their leader, a high-ranking officer in the Zelter military. The officer, a cruel and cold figure, regarded Elias with disdain. He saw nothing more than a broken human boy, one who was of no value. The officer's gaze was sharp, calculating. He had seen many humans before, and none had impressed him. But Elias wasn't just any human. His eyes, still burning with the pain of loss, intrigued the officer. There was something in the boy's gaze that made him pause for a moment. "Take him to the slave pits," the officer ordered. Elias was thrown into a dark, damp cell with other captives. The conditions were unbearable, filthy, cold, and overcrowded. Yet, in the midst of all the suffering, Elias' mind remained sharp. His body had been beaten, but his spirit was not yet broken. He remembered his father's words before the invasion: "Fight for what you believe in, even when all seems lost." The pain and despair that flooded Elias' heart were intense, but it was also a fuel that burned inside him. He would survive. He had no choice. And one day, he would find a way to escape this nightmare. Months passed, and Elias was forced to work in the mines, digging for precious metals that the Zelter needed to power their war machines. The work was grueling, and the overseers were merciless. But Elias' resolve only grew stronger. Each day, he watched the Zelter soldiers, observing their patterns, their routines, and the weaknesses in their defenses. He had learned early on that the only way to survive was to stay unnoticed, to wait for an opportunity. Then, one day, an opportunity came. The Zelter were always looking for new ways to entertain themselves, and one of their favorite pastimes was the gladiatorial games. They would pit captives, slaves, and prisoners against each other in brutal combat, forcing them to fight for the amusement of the alien officers. The Zelter had a strange sense of honor, one that valued strength, skill, and the will to survive. Elias was thrown into the arena, a place where only the strongest and most ruthless survived. His first fight was against a massive alien warrior, a brute whose size and strength seemed unbeatable. But Elias wasn't intimidated. He had nothing left to lose. He was no longer the boy who had been broken by grief. He was a fighter now, driven by a singular goal: survival. The battle was brutal. Elias was outmatched physically, but he had something the alien warrior didn't: strategy. He used his agility and his quick thinking to outsmart his opponent. He saw an opening and took it, using the warrior's own momentum against him. With a swift move, he brought the alien to the ground, and the crowd went silent. Ilias' victory was unexpected, but it was only the beginning. He was no longer just a slave. He was a fighter, and his name started to spread among the Zelter ranks. The more fights he won, the more attention he attracted. Soon, he was being brought before the highest-ranking officials, who began to see him as a tool to use, not just a slave to discard. They offered him a choice: continue fighting in the gladiatorial arena or join their elite forces as a soldier. Ilias knew that the Zelter were cruel, but he also understood that this was his chance. If he could survive in their world, he might one day be able to exact revenge on the empire that had destroyed everything he loved. He accepted. Training was harsh. The Zelter were unforgiving taskmasters, pushing Ilias to his limits. But Ilias was no longer the scared boy he had once been. The pain he endured only made him stronger. He learned quickly, adapting to their brutal methods and honing his combat skills. He trained alongside alien soldiers, each one stronger and more experienced than him, but he wasn't deterred. Ilias had one thing they didn't: the burning desire to survive and to avenge his fallen family. By the end of his training, Ilias had transformed. He was no longer the same young boy who had wandered the streets of his village, helpless and broken. He was a weapon, refined by pain, shaped by loss, and driven by the need for justice. He would rise, and when he did, the galaxy would tremble success in the Zelter's ranks. What had begun as a means of survival, a way to gain power and exact revenge, was now something he feared might change him in ways he couldn't control. As the weeks turned into months, the once helpless boy who had watched his family die had transformed into a cold and calculated soldier, rising quickly through the ranks of the Zelter military. He had become a fearsome figure among the aliens, known for his uncanny ability to outsmart and defeat those who were physically superior. He wasn't the strongest, but he was the smartest. His ability to read his opponents, to anticipate their moves before they even made them, had earned him a reputation. The Zelter military leaders saw something in him, something they could use. His rise, however, wasn't without consequences. Each victory brought him closer to the very heart of the Empire, and with it, greater responsibility. The Empire was ruthless, unyielding in its quest for control. They sent Ilias on missions to crush rebellions, to silence those who dared defy them. He became a symbol of terror, not just to the humans who had once been his kin, but to anyone who opposed the Zelter. But despite the blood on his hands, Ilias still clung to the promise he had made to himself. He would rise. He would survive. And one day, he would tear down the empire that had taken everything from him. His latest mission was one that sent a shiver down his spine. The Zelter had received reports of a rebellion on a distant planet, a place that had once been home to an ancient civilization. It was a world known for its rich history and deep connection to the stars. But now, it was a place of resistance, a place where people fought for their freedom. Ilias was assigned to lead a strike force to eradicate the rebels. The task seemed simple: crush the resistance, show them the might of the Zelter, and restore order. But when Ilias arrived on the planet, something felt different. The rebels weren't like the others he had faced before. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for something more. He had seen it in their eyes, something that reminded him of the fire he had once had, the fire that had burned inside him after his family's death. They weren't afraid. They were determined. Ilias could have easily crushed them, just as he had done countless times before. He had the power, the strength, the resources. But something inside him began to stir. Was this what he had become? A tool of oppression, used to crush the hopes of those who only wanted freedom. It wasn't just the rebels who were resisting the Zelter. It was every part of his being. For the first time, Elias was faced with a choice that wasn't about survival. It was about who he was becoming, who he was willing to be. Could he continue being a pawn of the Zelter, or had he reached a point where his soul could no longer bear the weight of their cruelty? The decision weighed heavily on him as he prepared to lead his forces into battle. The rebellion was entrenched in a stronghold at the edge of the planet's largest city, and the Zelter had come prepared to wipe them out. Elias' mission was clear: destroy the resistance, eliminate any leaders, and return to the Empire victorious. But as he surveyed the battlefield, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. He had fought countless battles before, but this one was different. This was a fight he couldn't win with strength alone. He couldn't just destroy. He needed to think, to calculate, to find a way to strike without becoming the monster he feared he was turning into. In the chaos of the battle, Elias fought as he always did, strategically. He led his men with precision, cutting through the enemy lines with ease. But as the day wore on, something unexpected happened. The rebels fought back harder than any force he had ever faced. They didn't fear death. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their way of life. In the heat of the conflict, Elias found himself face to face with the leader of the rebellion, a young woman who stood tall despite the overwhelming odds against her. Her eyes burned with the same fire that had once consumed him. Elias saw in her the same determination, the same resolve to never give in. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Despite her ragged appearance, there was a quiet strength in her, a kind of peaceful defiance that spoke louder than any weapon. The woman didn't beg for mercy. She didn't plead for her life. Instead, she spoke words that cut through Elias' soul. "Do you really think you're any different from them?" she asked, her voice calm yet firm. "You think you're fighting for a greater cause, but all you're doing is feeding the machine that destroys everything you care about. You're just like them." The words hit Elias harder than any blow he had ever received. He didn't answer her. He couldn't. Instead, he raised his weapon, ready to strike her down as the Zelter had trained him to do. But as his hand moved, something stopped him. A moment of clarity, a realization that shook him to his core. In that moment, Elias saw the truth. He was just another cog in the Zelter machine. A weapon, nothing more. All his victories, all his power had been built on a foundation of blood and pain. He wasn't fighting for freedom. He was fighting to maintain the very empire that had destroyed everything he loved. With a final, silent decision, Elias lowered his weapon. The woman stood before him, confused but hopeful. Elias didn't know what would happen next. He had no plan, no escape route. But one thing was certain: he would no longer be a pawn in their game. The battle didn't end that day. The Zelter soldiers pushed forward, determined to finish what Elias had started. But as Elias watched, he realized that the future was no longer written in blood and destruction. It was something else. It was the fight for something greater, something he hadn't even realized he was capable of until now. He turned his back on the Zelter, walking away from the battlefield. His decision would cost him everything, but it was the only choice that mattered. Elias' path had changed. The pain of his past, the anger, the need for revenge, it had all been leading him to this moment. The destruction he had witnessed, the loss he had felt, was now his to change. But it wouldn't be easy. He would have to fight his former masters, his former self, in order to become something better. As Elias walked away, the weight of his past didn't lift, but he could feel a new fire burning within him, a fire that was his own. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was something more. He was a force of change. Elias knew he had made a decision that could never be undone. Walking away from the Zelter was not something he could take back. He had turned his back on everything he had fought for, everything he had become. His mind raced as he walked through the barren landscape, his thoughts as dark as the night sky above him. He had no plan, no clear idea of what to do next. All he had now was the weight of his choices and the burning question of whether he could truly change. He had left the battlefield, leaving his fellow soldiers and the Zelter behind. His reputation, his status within the empire, everything he had worked for, was now a distant memory. Elias felt a heavy emptiness in his chest. He had betrayed his former comrades, those he had once called allies. He had walked away from a life that had consumed him, but the question remained, was it worth it? The world around him was still, as if waiting for him to make his next move. He could feel the ground beneath his boots as he walked, each step forward a quiet declaration of his intent to break free. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't turn back. His mission had changed. It was no longer about vengeance or survival. It was about something deeper, something that he had only just begun to understand. Elias spent the next few days wandering, lost in his own thoughts. His body was tired and his heart was heavy, but he couldn't afford to rest. The Zelter wouldn't let him go so easily. They would hunt him down, seek to eliminate the traitor who had turned against their empire. Elias knew he had to keep moving to find some way to fight back. But how? What could one man do against an empire so vast, so powerful? He couldn't do it alone. That much was clear, but he wasn't entirely alone. Elias had seen the rebels before. They were the ones who had stood against the empire, who had fought for freedom, the ones he had once been ordered to destroy. He had seen their determination, their refusal to bow to the Zelter. He had seen their courage, and for the first time he had recognized something in them, something he hadn't realized he had lost. Hope. It was time to find them again. He didn't know where to begin, but he had to try. The future depended on it. After several days of traveling through rough terrain, Elias stumbled upon a small village nestled deep in the mountains. It wasn't much, just a handful of homes built from the land around them, but it was enough. The villagers were poor, but they had something Elias hadn't seen in a long time: peace. They didn't have the wealth or the power of the empire, but they had their freedom. And that was something Elias hadn't had since the Zelter had invaded his world. He approached the village cautiously, aware that he was a stranger in a land that might not welcome him. He had no name now, no rank, just a man with a past that he couldn't erase. But he needed help. He couldn't do this alone. He had to find the rebels. They were his only chance. As he entered the village, Elias was met with wary eyes. The people there were not hostile, but they didn't trust outsiders easily. He could see it in their faces, the quiet suspicion, the hesitation. Elias had learned to read people's emotions during his time with the Zelter, and he could tell that these people had seen their share of trouble. He approached the village leader, a woman named Annika, who was older than him but carried herself with a quiet strength. She had the look of someone who had been through hardship but had survived it. Elias told her his story, or at least parts of it, the parts that were relevant. He didn't mention his time as a soldier of the Zelter, but he explained how he had seen the Empire's cruelty and how he wanted to fight back. Annika listened quietly, her gaze never leaving his face. When he finished, she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she looked at him as though weighing his words, deciding whether he could be trusted. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she nodded. "You've made the right choice, Elias," she said softly. "But your journey won't be easy. The Zelter are not easily defeated. If you truly wish to help us, you must understand what you're fighting for." Elias nodded, knowing that she was right. He had no illusions about the task ahead. The Zelter were ruthless and their empire was vast, but he couldn't back down now. He had already made his choice. "Where do we begin?" he asked. Annika smiled, a small but determined smile. "We begin by uniting the people who are still fighting, those who haven't yet been crushed by the empire. We need to gather forces, build an army. It will take time, but we'll start small. There are pockets of resistance all across the galaxy. We have to find them." For the next few months, Elias worked alongside Annika and the rebels to gather support. They moved in secret, carefully avoiding the Zelter's patrols and trying to stay out of sight. It was hard work, and Elias sometimes wondered if it was all for nothing. But each day, as he saw the faces of those who had joined their cause, he felt a flicker of hope. The more people they found, the more powerful their resistance became. Elias knew it wasn't enough, not yet. But they had something the Zelter didn't: determination. They weren't fighting for control or power. They were fighting for their freedom, for their homes, for their families. And that made all the difference. Then one day, as Elias and the rebels gathered in a remote outpost, a message came through, a message that changed everything. It was from an old contact, someone Elias had known during his time in the Zelter's army. The contact had risked his life to send the message, knowing it could mean his death. But he had important information, information that could turn the tide in their favor. The Zelter had been hiding something, a weapon, a secret that could change the balance of power. It was a massive, planet-destroying weapon, capable of annihilating entire worlds. The weapon was hidden deep within the heart of the Empire, in a fortress that no one had ever been able to penetrate. But the contact had provided the coordinates. And he had one other piece of information. The weapon could be destroyed, but only if it was disabled from within. Elias knew what he had to do. This was their chance. If they could take down the weapon, they could cripple the Zelter's empire and shift the balance of power in the galaxy. He gathered the rebels and explained the plan. It was risky, dangerous, and it would take everything they had. But it was their only chance. For weeks they prepared, gathering everything they needed for the mission. Elias trained the rebels, teaching them the strategies he had learned during his time with the Zelter. He had become a skilled leader, and the rebels respected him for it. But as the day of the mission approached, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was too much at stake. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavy on his mind. The day came. Elias led the group of rebels to the Zelter fortress, hidden deep within enemy lines. They fought their way through waves of enemy soldiers, using the element of surprise to their advantage. Elias had never felt more alive, more certain of his purpose. This was what he had been fighting for. They reached the weapon. It was massive, a monstrous machine that dwarfed everything around it. Elias and his team fought their way through the fortress's final defenses, reaching the core of the weapon. But as they stood there, facing the machine, Elias realized that the greatest challenge wasn't the weapon itself. It was the decision they had to make. Elias could destroy the weapon, but it would cost him everything. The Zelter would retaliate, and the entire galaxy would be plunged into chaos. But if they didn't destroy it, the Zelter would use it to wipe out the resistance and solidify their rule forever. The decision was clear. With a heavy heart, Elias activated the destruction sequence. The weapon began to power down, and as it did, Elias felt a sense of finality. This was it, the beginning of the end for the Zelter. As the fortress began to collapse around them, Elias led the rebels out, knowing that they had struck a blow that would echo across the galaxy. They had taken the first step toward freedom, but Elias knew that the fight was far from over. The Zelter were still out there, still powerful, still a threat. But for the first time, Elias felt a sense of hope. They had done it. They had brought down the Empire's greatest weapon, and with it, they had begun to write a new future for the galaxy. Elias had not only changed his fate, but he had changed the fate of everyone he had met along the way. He had proven that even the most broken of souls could rise to become something greater.